My Ring camera caught my mom rehearsing tears, my dad practicing "We Miss You," and my sister directing them like actors, all to drag me back into a family lie. I opened the door smiling and asked one question that shattered the script: what would you do next, honestly, today? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type "interested" in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Naya, I'm 31, and I need you to picture this with me because it still feels unreal even saying it out loud. I'm sitting on my couch in my tiny one-bedroom in the Alberta Arts District in Portland, Oregon, wearing old hospital scrubs I forgot to change out of, hair in a messy knot, feet swollen from another ICU shift, and my phone buzzes with motion detected at front door, like it's some random package. But when I open the live feed, my stomach drops so hard it's like my body forgot how to be upright, because there on my porch are my parents and my older sister, and they're not ringing the bell, they're just performing, and I mean performing like it's opening night, and the critics are in the front row. My mother is literally practicing how to cry. Dab, pause, sniff, look up, my dad is mumbling, "We miss you, sweetheart," like he's memorizing a pledge, and my sister Lila is standing there with her phone held up like a director's clipboard correcting them. "No, Mom." Tears. First, then apology. "Dad, uncross your arms. You look defensive. Say it slower, like you mean it." And I'm watching this thinking, wait, is this a prank? Is this grief hallucination? Is this what my brain does when it's finally had enough? And then Lila says the line that makes my chest go cold. "Remember, the goal is to get her to Nana's birthday. We don't actually have to mean it. We just need her to think we're sorry." And I swear to you, my whole childhood snapped into focus like a camera. Finally finding the subject, because that sentence was my family's religion. They didn't do truth. They did optics, they didn't do accountability, they did choreography. And if you've ever been the easy one in the family, the one who's always told to be mature, be understanding, don't cause stress, you already know what I'm talking about. You become the person they use as a sponge. You soak up the mess so nobody else has to look at it, and then they get mad at you for being wet. So when I saw my own mother rehearsing tears on my porch like she was auditioning for sympathy, I didn't even feel heartbreak first. I felt something scarier, clarity, like, oh, so this was never love, this was strategy. And I want to know right now, before we go any further, if you caught this on your doorbell camera, would you open the door, or would you let them stand out there and sweat? Because I'm not even joking. I sat there staring at the screen like I was watching a nature documentary about predators testing a fence, and the worst part is my first instinct was still to protect them, to protect their image, to protect the family story, because that's how deeply they trained me. But I didn't. I saved the video to the cloud, backed it up, and I took a breath so slow it hurt, because I realized something. I wasn't angry like I used to be, I wasn't panicking, I was calm, and that calm felt like power. Like the first time I ever held a receipt in a store where I'd been getting overcharged my whole life. And here's what you need to know about me to understand why this moment mattered. I grew up as the understandable daughter. My sister Lila got the big room because she was older, okay. She got new shoes, I got hers when the soles were already thin, okay. She got to go to a private university because she had potential, and I went to community college because we're tight right now. And every time I pushed back, my mom had the same sentence loaded like a dart. "Why are you being selfish? Your sister needs it more." Which is a wild thing to say to a kid, because it teaches you that you only earn love by shrinking, by folding yourself into the space everyone else already occupies. And I did it so well I became invisible. And when I became a nurse and got stable, good benefits, the kind of stable job that makes you stop checking your bank account every 5 minutes, I thought I'd finally earned peace. But no, I had just become useful. I became the family's quiet emergency fund. The backup plan they could drain without guilt because they'd built a whole story about why it was fair. Naya is responsible. Naya doesn't have kids. Naya can handle it. And if you're listening and that sounds familiar, let me tell you the brutal truth. Being the dependable one doesn't make you respected. It makes you harvestable. So over 5 years I loaned them money for rent, for a car repair, for just until next month. And it added up to $30-something thousand. And not 1 cent came back. Not because they forgot, because they never intended to. In their minds, my money was family money, and family money was Lila money, and I was just the pipeline. And I kept telling myself family helps family, because I wanted to believe that phrase meant something warm. But in my house it meant shut up and pay. Then Nana's health started slipping. My grandmother, the only person in that whole family who ever looked at me like I was a full human, she had Medicare, but the gaps were brutal. The co-pays, the specialists, the physical therapy, and I said we should make a joint account for her care, something clean, transparent, something that couldn't be twisted, and Lila smiled like she was on a talk show and said, "Great idea, we'll both contribute," and I deposited $500 a month like clockwork for 2 years because when I make a promise I keep it, even when no one else does. And then one night, I checked the balance before Nana's cardiology appointment, and it was basically empty, and I thought I must be looking at the wrong screen, like, there's no way, so I refreshed, checked again, and my hands started shaking the way they do when you're about to start in 4, and you can't, not because you're incompetent, because your body knows something is wrong. I called Lila, and she was breezy. "Oh, that, I moved it into an investment, real estate, it'll double in 6 months. Don't be dramatic, dramatic. Imagine someone taking money meant for oxygen and calling you dramatic for breathing," and I drove to my parents' house thinking, okay, they'll be horrified, they'll fix it, this is where parents step up, right? And my mom looked at me with that old disappointment like I'd spilled juice on her carpet, and she said, "Why are you trying to embarrass your sister?" And my dad sat in his chair like a statue, wouldn't look at me, wouldn't say a word, and in that moment I finally understood. My parents weren't neutral. They were aligned. Their silence wasn't peace. It was approval. It was the referee watching someone cheat and calling it family, and I walked out knowing something had snapped that I couldn't glue back together. And the next morning I blocked all 3 of them. And I'm not going to lie, the first week felt like detox. My phone was quiet. My house was quiet. My chest stopped living in a constant flinch. And for the first time since I was a teenager, I slept through the night. Not that fake sleep where you wake up ready to apologize for existing, real sleep. And my coworkers noticed. My friend Samira said, "You look lighter." And I laughed because I didn't know you could feel light at 31. I thought adulthood was just carrying things forever. But then Nana's 75th birthday started creeping closer, and I missed her so much it was physical, like hunger, and every time I tried to reach her, somehow Lila was coincidentally there. "Oh, she's napping. Oh, she's not feeling well. I'll tell her you called," and Nana never called back, which made me wonder how many messages never made it through. And then I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Naya, sweetheart, it's Nana. Using the neighbor's phone. My birthday is October 15th. Please come. I have something important to tell the family. I love you." And I read it so many times I could have recited it in my sleep because she wanted me there, and I knew Lila would try to control every second of that day like a stage manager guarding a show. And I hadn't even decided what to do when 3 days later my Ring camera gave me the preview of the performance on My Porch. So when they finally rang the bell, I didn't rush. I gave myself 30 seconds, looked in the mirror, and I did something I've never done in my life. I practiced my own calm, because calm is the one thing you can't argue with, and I opened the door smiling, and my mom launched into the tears right on cue. "Naya, baby, we've missed you so much." And I said, softly, politely, like we were discussing the weather, "How many times did you practice that?" And I watched the whole script collapse. My mom froze mid-sob. My dad's line died in his throat. And Lila's face twitched for half a second, a tiny flash of panic before she rebuilt the mask, and I pointed at the camera and I said, "It records before you press the bell. By the way, I watched the entire rehearsal, the tears, the lines, the directing, and I heard you, Lila, say you don't have to mean it, and I want you to understand what that felt like. It wasn't a shouting match. It was like setting a glass of water down on a table and watching 3 people realize the table is on fire. Because they couldn't deny it. They couldn't gaslight me. The evidence was literal video and audio. My mom stopped crying instantly like someone turned off a faucet. My dad looked at the ground. And Lila did what manipulators always do when they can't control the truth. She tried to make the truth illegal. Recording your own family is a violation of privacy. And I said, "It's my porch." And then she tried to pivot to character assassination. "You've changed, you're cold." And I almost laughed. Because yes, I changed, I grew boundaries, and boundaries look cold to people who used your warmth to cook their meals. And then my dad finally said the real reason they were there. "Your grandmother's birthday is next week, she wants you there." And I said, "I know, she told me." And my mother leaned in with that old tone like I was 12 again, and she was about to correct my personality. "So you'll come and you won't cause any scenes." And that right there, that was the giveaway because notice what she didn't ask. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't ask if I'd been hurt. She didn't ask about Nana's money. She asked me to behave, to keep the picture pretty, to be useful one more time, and I told them, "I'm coming for Nana. Not for you, I'll arrive on my own, and if people ask questions, let them. And Lila's phone buzzed and she stepped aside and took a call, and I heard just enough to make my brain sit up. Ty, I told you I'm handling it. No, she hasn't agreed yet. I know the deadline is, and she cut herself off when she saw my face, and I asked, what deadline? And she snapped, none of your business, and I said, you're on my porch asking me for favors, so yeah, it becomes my business. And they left, and I watched their car roll away, and I felt something I didn't expect, not victory, not revenge, suspicion, because that deadline wasn't about love, it was about pressure, and pressure usually means money or consequences, and I need to pause you right here, because this is where you and I become the gossip committee together, okay? Because if your sister is sweating about a deadline and suddenly your parents can't live without you, what's your first guess? Is it inheritance, debt, legal trouble, or something even messier? Tell me what you think you'd bet on, and while you're at it, where are you watching from right now? And what time is it there? Because I want to see how far this story is reaching, and I want to know I'm not alone in this. I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon, and it's raining like it always does, and my phone is in my hand like it weighs 50 pounds, so after they left I couldn't sleep. Not because I was crying, I was past crying, I was thinking, and thinking is dangerous in a family like mine because thinking is how you stop obeying, so I did what any formerly obedient daughter does when she finally stops obeying. I started collecting facts. I called the one relative I still trusted, my Aunt Marisol, my Mom's younger sister, a family law attorney with a spine made of steel, and I told her about the rehearsal video and the weird phone call, and she sighed like she'd been waiting years for me to finally say the quiet part out loud. Your grandmother asked me about inheritance law last month, she said, and my stomach did that drop again. The house specifically, and if you don't know, Nana's Victorian in Laurelhurst is worth a fortune. And in my family, money isn't just money, it's oxygen. People become saints or villains based on who gets what, and Marisol said, I think your sister is managing a narrative. If your grandmother senses conflict, she'll ask questions, and Lila cannot afford questions right now. And I said, so that's the deadline. And Marisol didn't even deny it. She just said, show up, be calm, and do not let them bait you into looking unstable, because they will try, and if you have evidence, keep it ready. And when I hung up, I did something I hadn't done in 8 months. I opened the old family group chat because I'd left but I hadn't deleted it, and I scrolled until I found messages that made my skin crawl. Lila texting my mom, if Naya asks for the money back, just tell her I'm going through a hard time. She won't push. And my mom replying, she never does. And Lila saying, exactly, that's why she's useful. Useful. The word felt like someone slapped a label on my forehead, and suddenly my entire life made sense. So, I screenshot everything, made a folder, saved the Ring video, saved the group chat receipts, and I promised myself something that might sound small, but it's huge. I promised I would not walk into Nana's birthday empty-handed again. Not emotionally, not mentally, not legally, because if Lila's plan was to paint me as the unstable sister who abandoned the family, then my plan was to be painfully, boringly, irrefutably truthful. The kind of truth that doesn't need yelling, the kind that just sits there and makes everyone else sweat. And on Friday night before the party, I laid out my outfit like I was prepping for court. Simple navy dress, flats, no drama, because the whole trap in families like mine is they want you to react. They want you to be the explosion so they can call you the problem. So I decided to be the pause, the silence, the calm face that forces their performance to look like what it is, a performance. And I'm going to tell you right now, the moment I stepped onto Nana's porch the next day, I knew Lila didn't just want me there, she needed me there because the house was packed, like 30 people packed. Neighbors, aunts, cousins I hadn't seen in years, a full audience, and you don't build an audience for love, you build an audience for control. And as I raised my hand to ring Nana's doorbell, I realized I wasn't walking into a birthday party. I was walking into a staged trial where my sister planned to be the victim, and I was supposed to play the villain. And the only question was, what was she hiding that required this many witnesses? Because whatever it was big enough to make my parents rehearse tears on my porch like clowns. And I don't know about you, but when people start acting, it's because the truth would destroy them. And I was about to find out exactly what truth Lila was willing to burn everyone for. I rang Nana's doorbell exactly at 2 o'clock, not early, not late, because timing is power in families like mine, and the door opened to the smell of roast chicken, lavender cleaner, and nostalgia so thick it almost knocked me backward. Nana stood there smaller than I remembered but sharp-eyed, smiling like she'd been waiting for me specifically. There's my girl. she said, pulling me into a hug that felt like permission to exist. And over her shoulder, I saw Lila freeze mid-laugh. Champagne. Flute hovering just a second too long near her mouth. My mother's smile tightening. My father suddenly fascinated by the fireplace. And I knew right then the stage had been set, and the lead actress was not happy about a surprise cast change. Nana took my hand and led me straight past everyone, not to a corner seat, not to the kids' table, but to the chair beside her, front and center like a statement she didn't have to explain. And if you've ever been demoted in your own family, you know how loud a simple seating choice can be, because suddenly everyone's eyes were on me like they were recalculating a story they'd already decided was true. Lila recovered fast, I'll give her that. She always did. She floated over with her perfect smile and kissed Nana's cheek. "Isn't this just perfect?" she said loudly, like she was pitching a lifestyle brand. And Nana smiled politely, but didn't look away from me. And that's when I realized something had shifted, not just for me, but for her. The party moved around us like a play already in motion, cousins asking about my job with that curious pity tone, uncles complimenting my dress like they'd just met me, everyone trying to figure out if I matched the version of me they'd been sold for the last 8 months, and I could feel Lila watching me from across the room, tracking my reactions, waiting for a crack she could widen, because that's how she operates. She doesn't attack head-on. She waits for you to show weakness, and then calls it concern. And right when the appetizers came out, she made her move. She clinked her glass and smiled that pageant smile and said, "Before we eat, I just want to say how special it is to have everyone here, especially my little sister, who's been going through such a hard time lately." And there it was, the narrative, laid gently on the table like a centerpiece. Poor fragile Naya, overwhelmed, unstable, back where she belongs. And my mom jumped in immediately. "Yes, we've been so worried about her. Work stress, you know how it is." And people murmured sympathetically, nodding like they were watching a documentary about a wounded animal, and I felt that old familiar pressure in my chest, the urge to explain, to correct, to defend, but I didn't. I just smiled and took a sip of water, because here's the thing they never expect: silence from someone who used to beg to be understood. And Nana noticed. She squeezed my hand under the table and said quietly, "You're being very patient." And I whispered back, "I learned from you." And she gave me that look, the one that says she knows exactly what's happening. Lila kept going. "Family is everything. No matter what disagreements happen, we show up for each other." And if you've been through this kind of manipulation, you know how enraging that sentence is, because it's always spoken by the person who causes the disagreements and then demands forgiveness as payment. And I watched faces around the table, some buying it, some skeptical. Aunt Marisol's face unreadable, Cousin Tessa squinting like she was doing mental math, and then Nana cleared her throat and said, "Let's eat before the food gets cold." And the tension eased just enough for Lila to think she'd won the round. Dinner was served, and I noticed things I'd never noticed before: how Lila barely touched her plate, how she kept checking her phone under the table. Our husband, Evan, looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Dark circles, jaw tight, drinking faster than everyone else. How my father's hands shook slightly when he lifted his fork. How my mother kept glancing at Nana like she was afraid she might say something unscripted. And if you're watching this and thinking, "Wow, she's reading into things," let me tell you, when you spend your whole life scanning a room for emotional danger, you get very good at noticing micro cracks. And halfway through dinner, Nana leaned toward me and said, "After we eat, I'm going to say something to everyone." And my heart skipped. "Something important," she added, and before I could ask what, Lila stood up again, because of course she did. Manipulators can't stand unscheduled moments, and she raised her glass. "Before Nana speaks, I just want to say how proud I am of this family, especially my parents, who have done so much for both of us girls." And she looked right at me when she said both, daring me to react. And my mom smiled like she'd been handed a life raft. My dad nodded stiffly, and Nana's eyes sharpened. She didn't interrupt, but she didn't toast either. She just watched. And that's when I realized Lila wasn't celebrating. She was buffering. She was trying to control the order of information, because if Nana spoke first, Lila wouldn't get to frame it. And sure enough, as soon as Lila sat down, Nana stood, slowly, deliberately, the way someone does when they want the room to feel it. Conversations died instantly. Forks paused midair. "I want to thank you all for coming," Nana said, voice steady. 75 years is a long time. Long enough to learn a few things about people, and she paused, scanning faces, lingering on Lila just a second longer than comfortable. I've been thinking a lot about family lately, about how we treat each other, about what love actually looks like, and my stomach flipped. Lila's smile froze. My mom shifted in her chair. My dad stared at the table. I've seen kindness, Nana continued, and I've seen convenience dressed up as love. And there it was, the first crack in the performance. You could feel it ripple through the yard. Lila laughed lightly, too lightly. Oh, Nana, you always have such a way with words, trying to turn it into a joke. But Nana didn't smile. I'm serious, she said, and before I talk about the future, I want to address the past. And Lila's phone buzzed again. She glanced at it, face draining of color, and I swear you could hear her heartbeat in the silence. Nana turned to me, right in front of everyone. Naya, sweetheart, will you answer a question for me? And every muscle in my body locked. Why haven't you spoken to your parents in 8 months? And there it was, no buffer, no spin, no private conversation, just the truth placed gently in the middle of the table like a test no one studied for. Lila jumped up. Grandma, this isn't appropriate, my mom chimed in. Yes, we can talk about this later. But Nana raised her hand and the room obeyed. I didn't ask you, she said calmly. I asked Naya, and I took a breath, the kind of breath you take before you jump into cold water, and I said, because of the savings account. Murmurs started immediately. The one we set up for your medical expenses. Nana nodded. I put in $500 a month for 2 years, $12,000 total. And when I checked it before your cardiology appointment, it was gone. And the sound the room made was like air leaving a balloon. Lila took it, I said, voice steady. She said it was an investment. And when I confronted her, Mom and Dad told me I was embarrassing the family and being selfish. I looked at my parents, so I stopped answering their calls. Silence. Thick, uncomfortable. My mom opened her mouth. Naya is exaggerating, she said weakly. Nana didn't look at her. Lila, Nana, said, did you take the money? Lila's eyes filled with tears instantly. Real ones this time, or at least better acted. Grandma, I was trying to grow it for you. Naya doesn't understand business. Nana's voice didn't rise. Yes or no? And Lila hesitated just a second too long. Yes, she whispered, and that's when Evan stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the patio. Tell them, he said, voice shaking. Lila spun on him. Sit down. But he didn't. Tell them about the debt, he said, louder now. Tell them why you needed Nana to keep the house and the family. Gasps erupted. My heart pounded. $50,000, Evan said, eyes glassy. That's how much she owes, gambling, online betting. She's been lying to all of you. And if you've never watched a golden child fall off the pedestal in real time, let me tell you, it's violent in a quiet way. Lila's mask shattered. How dare you, she screamed. You're ruining me. And Evan shook his head. You ruined yourself. And walked away, leaving Lila standing alone in the middle of her own set. And she did the only thing she had left. She pointed at me. This is a setup, she yelled. Naya planned this. She's been recording us, collecting evidence. She's sick. And eyes turned back to me, some suspicious, some confused, some waiting, and I felt that old fear creep in. The fear of being the problem, the one who breaks the family. And then Aunt Marisol stood up, calm as ever. If we're talking about recordings, she said, perhaps we should hear them. And Lila's face went white. You wouldn't. She hissed at me, and I pulled out my phone, my hand steady, and I said, this is for my Ring camera. And I pressed play. My mother's voice filled the yard. Practice the tears again. My father reciting his line, and Lila's voice clear as day. We don't actually have to mean it. We just need her to think we're sorry. And when it ended, no one spoke. Nana closed her eyes. My mom covered her mouth. My dad stared at the ground like it might open up and swallow him. And Nana stood again. I've heard enough, she said. I love you all, but I will not reward dishonesty. She looked at Lila, and I will not punish kindness. She didn't say what she was changing. She didn't have to. The message landed anyway. People started leaving quietly, whispers trailing behind them. The party dissolved into awkward clusters, and my mom came up to me, face tight with anger and something like shame. Are you happy now? She asked, and I said, I didn't do this to be happy. I did it because I was done lying. And she had no answer. My dad hovered nearby, eyes red. I'm sorry, he said softly, and I believed he meant it, at least a little. Nana hugged me longer than she ever had. Thank you for telling the truth, she whispered, and when I finally stepped away and walked down her front steps, the night air hit my face like a reset. My phone buzzed with messages from relatives who suddenly remembered my name, and Lila was nowhere to be seen, and as I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, I realized something important. This wasn't over, not even close, because when a manipulator loses control of the story, they don't stop, they escalate, and whatever Lila was hiding had just been exposed to light, but the fallout, the real consequences, were only just beginning, and I need you to tell me this right now. If you were in my position, would you have played the video, or would you have protected the peace one more time? And where are you watching from right now? Because the next thing that happened changed everything I thought I knew about loyalty, family, and what it actually costs to finally choose yourself. The morning after Nana's birthday didn't feel like a victory lap or a hangover. It felt like waking up after an earthquake when the dust is still hanging in the air and you're not sure which buildings are actually standing. My phone was already buzzing before I'd even made coffee. Messages stacked on messages from relatives who suddenly remembered my existence. Some apologetic, some curious, some fishing for details like this was the newest family gossip they could pass around with brunch. And I let them sit unanswered because for the first time in my life I wasn't interested in managing anyone else's feelings. Nana texted me first, just a simple good morning sweetheart with a heart emoji she'd learned how to use last year. And that one message grounded me more than all the others combined, because it reminded me that whatever chaos I'd stirred up, I hadn't imagined it, I hadn't exaggerated, and I hadn't done something unforgivable. I'd told the truth in a room that was allergic to it, and that kind of reaction only happens when you hit something real. By noon my mother called, not texted, called, which already told me she wanted control of the conversation. Her voice was tight, brittle, like she'd been rehearsing a speech in her head the same way she'd rehearsed those porch tears. We need to talk, she said. Not can we talk, not how are you feeling, but we need to talk, like this was a meeting she was chairing. And I told her calmly, I'm at work, I can talk later. And there was a pause, the sound of her recalibrating. Your father is very upset, she said, which in our family has always translated to you've done something wrong and now you need to fix it, and I surprised myself by responding, he's allowed to be upset. And then I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the unfamiliar sensation of not folding, and if you've ever been the peacekeeper, you know how disorienting that feels, like standing on a floor you've just realized is solid. When you've been tiptoeing your whole life. Nana called me later that afternoon and asked if I could come by, just us, no audience, no champagne flutes, and I said yes immediately because whatever happened next, I wanted to be near the one person who hadn't asked me to shrink. Her house was quiet when I arrived, the kind of quiet that comes after something big has happened. We sat at our kitchen table with mugs of tea, and she looked tired but clear. I didn't plan to expose everything like that, she said, but when I saw how quickly they try to paint you as fragile, I knew it was now or never. And that hit me hard because that's the thing about family betrayal. It's not just what they do, it's how easily they decide who you are without asking. Nana told me she'd suspected something was off for years, the way Lila always needed money, but never explained where it went. The way my parents defended her reflexively, the way my contributions were treated like background noise. I stayed quiet too long, she said, and I'm sorry for that. And that apology mattered more than any inheritance conversation ever could, because it acknowledged the cost of silence. I asked her straight out if she was changing her will, and she smiled softly. I already did, she said, but not because of the party, because of patterns. And then she said something that stuck with me. People think big betrayals are loud, but they're usually just small choices repeated. And if you're watching this and nodding, you know exactly what she meant. When I left Nana's house, my cousin Tessa texted me, I always wondered why you were the only one who ever brought food to holidays. And that made me laugh and ache at the same time, because it was such a small detail, but it said everything. That evening Lila texted me from a new number. I hadn't blocked that one yet. You humiliated me, she wrote. No greeting, no context, just accusation, and I stared at the screen for a long time before responding because part of me still wanted to fix it, to smooth it over, to make it okay, but another part of me was tired of absorbing blame for other people's choices, so I wrote back. I answered Nana's question honestly. And she fired back immediately. "You always do this. You play innocent and let other people look bad." And there it was, the inversion, the mental gymnastics that let her stay the hero in her own story. I didn't respond again, and that's when the real fallout started. My father showed up at my apartment 2 days later, unannounced, standing there like a man who didn't know where he belonged, and I let him in because I wanted to hear what he'd say without my mother there to translate for him. He sat on my couch, hands clasped, eyes red. "I didn't know how bad it was," he said, and I believed him and didn't believe him at the same time, because not knowing is often a choice, especially when knowing would require you to act. "Why didn't you stop her?" I asked quietly, and he stared at the floor. Because it was easier to tell myself it wasn't my problem, and that honesty hurt more than any excuse could have. He asked me what I wanted now, and I told him the truth. I want accountability, not apologies that disappear when things get uncomfortable. And he nodded like someone hearing a language he'd never learned. Before he left, he said, "Your mother is angry." And I said, "She's allowed to be." And for the second time that week, I didn't chase him with reassurance. A few days later, Nana called another family meeting, smaller this time, just immediate relatives, and the energy was completely different. No decorations, no catering, no performance. Just people sitting in a living room trying to figure out what comes after the illusion breaks. Lila didn't come. She sent a message saying she wasn't feeling well, which in her case could mean anything from a migraine to avoiding accountability. Nana didn't comment on her absence. She simply stated facts about the money, about the will, about expectations moving forward. And when my mother tried to argue that families should stick together no matter what, Nana said something that cut through the room. "Sticking together doesn't mean letting one person bleed so another can feel whole." And I swear you could hear a pin drop. After that meeting, alliances shifted quietly. Some relatives distanced themselves from Lila, others doubled down on defending her, and I learned something important in that process. Truth doesn't unify, it clarifies. It shows you exactly who people are willing to be when the cost is real. And somewhere in the middle of all this, life kept happening. I went to work, I paid my bills, I went to therapy for the first time in years and said out loud, "I think my family only loves me when I'm useful." And my therapist didn't flinch, she just nodded and said, "That's a heavy belief to carry." And it was heavier than I realized until I started putting it down. About a week after the party, Evan emailed me, not to apologize, but to thank me. He said watching the truth come out gave him the courage to stop lying to himself. He was filing for separation, and while part of me felt sad for the wreckage, another part felt relief, because secrets like that rot everyone involved. Lila sent one more message, longer this time, accusing me of ruining her life, of turning Nana against her, of being jealous, and buried in the middle of it was the real fear. "You took everything from me." And that's when I understood. She wasn't talking about money or reputation. She was talking about control, because for the first time, she couldn't rewrite the narrative fast enough. I blocked her after that, not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. And if you're watching this right now, pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from. Because I want you to be here with me for what comes next, not just passively listening, but actually thinking about your own story, your own dynamics, your own line in the sand, because the next phase wasn't about confrontation or exposure. It was about consequences, quiet ones, the kind that don't make for dramatic scenes but change everything over time. My mother stopped calling. My father started texting instead of showing up. Nana and I started having dinner together every Sunday, just us. And those dinners were healing in a way I didn't expect. No competition, no comparisons, just stories, laughter, and the feeling of being chosen without conditions. And as the weeks passed, I realized something else. The rage I'd expected to feel never really came. What came instead was grief. Grief for the version of family I thought I had. Grief for the younger me who kept trying harder, giving more, hoping one day it would be enough. And grief is quieter than anger, but heavier. It sits with you, asks questions, forces you to redefine yourself outside the roles you were assigned. And in that space, I started building something new, not a replacement family, but a chosen one. Friends who showed up without needing me to overextend. Routines that didn't revolve around crisis management. Boundaries that felt awkward but solid. And every once in a while, a wave of guilt would hit me, usually after a message from a relative hinting that I'd gone too far, and I'd remind myself of something Nana said. Guilt is what people use when they don't have a better argument. And that helped, because here's the uncomfortable truth: when you stop being useful, people who benefited from your compliance will call it cruelty, and the real test isn't whether you feel bad, it's whether you go back. And I didn't, because every time I thought about stepping in to fix things, I remembered the porch video, the rehearsal, the ease with which my pain was treated like a prop, and I knew I couldn't unknow that. I couldn't unsee it, and neither could they, even if they tried to pretend otherwise. The family didn't implode, not dramatically. It just rearranged itself. Some bonds weakened, some strengthened, some disappeared altogether. And in that rearrangement, I found something I'd never had before: clarity. And clarity is dangerous in systems built on denial, because once you have it, you start asking questions you never asked before, like who benefits from my silence, who gets uncomfortable when I speak, and why was I taught that love meant endurance instead of mutual respect? Those questions didn't have neat answers, but they had honest ones, and honesty, I've learned, is the most destabilizing force in a family that survives on performance. The dust hasn't fully settled, and maybe it never will, but I'm no longer bracing for impact. I'm standing in my own space, watching the pieces fall where they may, and the next thing that happened, the thing no one expected, not even me, forced my mother to make a choice she'd been avoiding her entire life. And the way she handled it told me everything I needed to know about whether reconciliation was possible or just another rehearsed line waiting to be delivered when the cameras were off. The choice my mother was forced to make didn't happen in a dramatic courtroom or a screaming match. It happened quietly, in a grocery store parking lot of all places, because that's where I ran into her a week later, both of us frozen for half a second like strangers who recognize each other but don't know the rules anymore. She looked smaller than I remembered, not older exactly, just deflated, like someone whose script had been shredded and who hadn't been given a replacement. She said my name softly, not accusing, not warm, just testing whether it still worked, and I felt that familiar pull in my chest, the instinct to step toward her and smooth things over. But I stayed where I was, card in hand, heart steady, and that pause told her everything, because she sighed and said, "Your sister isn't speaking to me." And there it was, the opening move, not "I'm sorry," not "Are you okay," but "Your sister's upset." As if that alone should reorder my priorities. I asked her why, and she hesitated before admitting that Lila had demanded she choose sides, cut me off completely, publicly disown my version of events, help her challenge Nana's decisions, and my mother had stalled, not because she disagreed, but because she didn't know which choice would cost her less. And in that moment I saw my mother clearly, not as a villain, not as a victim, but as someone who had spent her entire life outsourcing her spine, letting the loudest person in the room decide the moral weather. She asked me what I wanted, and I told her the truth. "I want you to stop pretending this is a misunderstanding and start calling it what it is." And she flinched like I'd slapped her, because naming things has always been her kryptonite. She said she needed time, and I nodded, because for once, time was something I was willing to give, but not indefinitely, not at my own expense. That night, she texted me a long message, carefully worded, full of phrases like "I never meant to hurt you," and "families are complicated and I hope we can move forward." And I read it twice before realizing what was missing: accountability. No acknowledgement of the money, the manipulation, the rehearsal, just vague sorrow and a request for absolution without confession. And something in me finally clicked. Forgiveness without truth is just another performance. So I replied with one sentence: "If you want a relationship with me, it starts with honesty, not damage control." And I turned my phone face down. The next few days were quiet, unsettlingly so, like the calm before a storm or the silence after something has died. Nana called me every morning just to check in. Sometimes we talked about heavy things, sometimes about nothing at all, and one afternoon she asked me, very casually, "Do you think your mother knows how afraid she is of your sister?" And that question opened a door I hadn't walked through before, because fear explains so much. Fear of confrontation, fear of losing the golden child, fear of admitting she'd been wrong for decades, and fear can make people cruel in subtle ways. Not loud cruelty, but neglect, dismissal, gaslighting, the kind that leaves no bruises but hollows you out. Nana told me she'd had a long talk with my mother the day before, no yelling, no threats, just facts. She'd laid out what she'd seen over the years, the imbalance, the way I was praised for being easy and punished for needing anything. And she'd given my mother a simple choice: continue pretending nothing happened and risk losing both daughters in different ways, or face it honestly and accept the consequences. My mother hadn't answered immediately. She'd cried, deflected, blamed stress, blamed circumstances, blamed everyone except herself, and Nana had let her, patiently, before saying, "I won't be here forever, and when I'm gone, you'll have to live with the truth you chose." And that landed harder than any ultimatum ever could. A few days later, my father emailed me again, this time, asking if we could talk. Just the two of us, no agenda, no fixing, just talk, and I agreed cautiously. We met at a small cafe halfway between our neighborhoods, neutral ground. He looked exhausted, like someone who hadn't slept well since the party, and after some awkward small talk, he said, "I should have protected you." And that sentence alone cracked something open in me, because it was the first time he'd named his role without qualifiers. He told me he'd spent years telling himself it wasn't his place to intervene, that siblings fight, that Lila needed more support, that I was strong enough to handle it, and as he said those words, he started crying, quietly, not performatively, and I realized something uncomfortable. Remorse doesn't erase harm, but it does change the future if it's real. He asked me what rebuilding trust would look like, and I told him honestly, "It looks like you standing up for me even when it makes things harder for you." And he nodded, because he knew. That was the part he'd always avoided. Around that time, rumors started circulating in the family. Lila had maxed out another credit card. Lila was blaming Nana for her stress. Lila was telling anyone who'd listen that I'd orchestrated everything to steal her inheritance. And for the first time, those rumors didn't reach me through frantic phone calls demanding explanations. They reached me as distant noise, like traffic outside a window I'd finally closed. And if you're still with me right now, pause for a second and tell me where you're watching from, because this is the point in the story where everything shifts, not with explosions, but with choices that can't be undone. Because the next thing that happened forced my mother to either grow or retreat permanently, and the way she responded changed the shape of our family for good. It happened on a Sunday afternoon when Nana invited my parents over for tea, just them, no other relatives, no witnesses, and she told me later that my mother arrived defensive, already braced for attack, while my father looked resigned, like a man prepared to accept whatever came. Nana didn't accuse or lecture. She asked questions, simple ones. Why was it easier to believe Cora was overreacting than to ask where the money went? Why did you let one daughter take and the other give without balance? What were you afraid would happen if you said no to Lila? And my mother deflected at first, citing stress, childhood patterns, generational trauma. All the language people use when they've learned just enough therapy speak to avoid accountability. But Nana kept circling back, gently, relentlessly, until finally my mother broke, not into tears, but into anger, real anger, at Lila, at herself, at the expectations she'd propped up and the lies she'd helped maintain. She admitted she'd known about the money earlier than she'd told me, that she'd hoped Lila would fix it before anyone noticed, that she'd convinced herself it was temporary. And Nana asked her the question that sealed it. If Cora had taken that money, would you have waited? And my mother had no answer, because the answer was no, and she knew it. Nana told me my mother sat in silence for a long time after that, staring at her hands like they belonged to someone else. And when she finally spoke, she said something unexpected. "I don't know how to be a good mother to both of them." And Nana replied, "Then start by not being a bad one to either." That conversation didn't fix everything, but it cracked the door open, because later that night, my mother texted me again, a different message this time, shorter, less polished. "I should have believed you. I'm sorry I didn't. I'm ashamed." And that word, ashamed, carried more weight than all her previous apologies combined. I didn't respond immediately, not because I wanted to punish her, but because I needed to check in with myself, to make sure I wasn't responding out of habit, out of relief, out of the old reflex to smooth things over. I waited until the next day, and then I replied, "Thank you for saying that. I'm open to talking, but I need consistency, not just words." And she agreed, tentatively, cautiously, like someone stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Meanwhile, Lila spiraled. That's the word everyone used. She sent Nana a barrage of messages alternating between pleading and rage. She accused my parents of betrayal. She accused me of manipulation. She accused the universe of conspiring against her, and Nana didn't engage. She sent one message, firm and final. I love you, but I will not enable this behavior. And then she stopped responding, and that boundary infuriated Lila more than anything else had, because it removed her favorite weapon, the endless emotional tug-of-war. She showed up at my parents' house unannounced, demanded money, demanded loyalty, demanded they cut me off completely. And for the first time, my mother said no, not softly, not apologetically, but clearly, and that no cost her dearly. Lila screamed, cried, threatened to disappear, threatened to expose family secrets, threatened self-destruction, and my parents did the hardest thing they'd ever done. They held the boundary. They offered help in the form of treatment, counseling, accountability, but not money, not lies, not scapegoats, and Lila left furious, telling them they'd chosen the wrong daughter. When I heard about that, I felt something complicated, not triumph, not schadenfreude, but grief, because this was the moment that could have happened years ago, the moment that might have saved everyone a lot of pain, but timing matters, and sometimes growth only comes after everything breaks. Weeks passed, then a month, life settled into a strange new normal. My relationship with my parents was cautious but real. We met for coffee occasionally, talked about neutral things at first, then gradually about harder ones. My mother started therapy. My father attended a support group Nana had recommended, and I kept my boundaries firm. No loans, no crisis management, no triangulation. Nana remained my anchor through all of it, reminding me that progress isn't linear and that I wasn't responsible for fixing anyone. And just when it felt like the worst was behind us, I got a call late one night from a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, I heard Lila's voice, slurred, frantic, saying, "You think you won, but you don't know everything." And then she said something that made my stomach drop, something that reframed the entire story and proved that the biggest revelation was still waiting to come out, a secret she'd been sitting on for years, a secret that didn't just explain her behavior, but threatened to tear what little stability we'd rebuilt straight down the middle. And as she started to talk, I realized the family I thought I understood was far more fragile and far more complicated than I'd ever imagined. The call from Lila didn't end with some dramatic confession right away. It unraveled slowly, like a loose thread she'd been daring someone to pull for years. Her voice kept oscillating between rage and something closer to panic, and she kept saying, "You don't know everything," like it was a spell she believed could still give her power. I asked her what she meant, calmly, because somewhere along this journey I'd learned that silence and steadiness make manipulators nervous, and after a long pause she laughed, a sharp brittle sound, and said, "Ask Nana who my real father is," then hung up, just like that, no explanation, no build-up, just a grenade lobbed into my lap at 11:47 p.m. I sat on my couch staring at my phone long after the screen went dark, replaying those words over and over, because they didn't just threaten Lila's image, they threatened the entire foundation of our family story. And the first thing my mind did, almost automatically, was try to minimize it. Maybe she's lying, maybe she's drunk, maybe this is just another tactic. But the second thing my mind did was remember Nana's quiet, watchful eyes, the way she'd always chosen her words carefully when talking about the past, the long pauses before certain names, and suddenly a dozen half-memories rearranged themselves into something heavier. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was panicking, but because something deep inside me knew this wasn't a bluff. It had the weight of truth behind it, the kind of truth people weaponize only when they're desperate. The next morning I went to Nana's house early, earlier than usual, the sun barely up, dew still clinging to the roses, and she knew something was wrong the moment she opened the door. She didn't ask what happened. She just said, "You heard from her." And that alone told me everything I needed to know. We sat at her kitchen table, the same one where she taught me how to roll dough and balance a checkbook, and when I told her exactly what Lila had said, Nana closed her eyes for a long moment, like someone bracing for a wave she'd seen coming for years. She didn't deny it, didn't ask for clarification, didn't pretend it was nonsense. She simply said, "I was hoping she'd never use that." And my stomach dropped, because hope is not something you attach to lies. Hope means truth you wish would stay buried. Nana explained slowly, carefully, that years ago, before my parents married, before the family story solidified into the version we all memorized, my mother had an affair, brief, intense, badly handled. And when Lila was born, there were questions my parents chose not to answer, tests they chose not to run, because the timing was messy and the truth inconvenient. Nana said my parents decided it was easier to raise Lila as my father's child than risk scandal, shame, or divorce. And when my father eventually suspected, he chose denial. Because denial preserved the image of the family he wanted more than the truth ever could. I asked the question that had been burning in my chest since the night before. Does Lila know? And Nana nodded. Yes. She found out in her 20s, accidentally, through medical paperwork that didn't add up, and instead of freeing her, the truth hollowed her out, because her entire sense of entitlement, of specialness, of being chosen, suddenly felt threatened, so she clung harder to control, harder to performance, harder to the idea that she deserved everything because somewhere inside she feared she deserved nothing. Nana wasn't excusing her behavior, she was explaining it. The way someone explains a storm after it's already destroyed your house. I asked why no one ever told me, and Nana met my eyes and said, because they thought protecting the lie was protecting the family. And that sentence landed like a final verdict, because it was the same logic behind everything else. The favoritism, the gaslighting, the silence, all of it in service of keeping the story intact. Even if the people inside it were slowly suffocating, I left Nana's house that morning feeling like the ground had shifted under my feet, not because the secret changed who I was, but because it exposed how much of my life had been shaped by a narrative designed to protect everyone except me. On the drive home, I kept thinking about Lila, about how that knowledge must have twisted her, how being raised as the golden child while knowing, deep down, that she was the family's biggest secret, might have fueled her desperation to be seen, to be rewarded, to be untouchable, and for the first time I felt something close to pity, not the kind that invites reconciliation, but the kind that lets you stop taking someone's cruelty personally. Later that day my parents called, both of them on speaker, their voices tense, and before they could ask anything I told them I knew. There was a long silence, the kind where you can hear people breathing and deciding whether to lie. One last time my father spoke first, his voice cracking. We were going to tell you someday, which is the phrase people use when they have no intention of ever telling the truth. My mother cried, apologized, explained, defended herself, all at once, and I listened without interrupting because for once, their explanations weren't for my benefit, they were for their own conscience. I told them I wasn't angry about the secret itself. What hurt was the pattern, the way lies had been used again and again to justify mistreatment, the way silence had always been chosen over fairness. And my father said something that surprised me. I think I've always known, and I think that made me resent you. And that admission, ugly and honest, sliced through me, because it confirmed what I'd felt my whole life, that I'd been punished not for what I'd done, but for what I represented. A mirror they didn't want to look into. If you're listening to this right now and thinking, this is where I'd lose my mind, I get it, I thought the same thing. But rage wasn't what came up, clarity was. Because suddenly, every imbalance had context, not justification, but explanation, and explanation is powerful. It stops you from internalizing blame that was never yours. About halfway through this mess, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? Because stories like this hit differently depending on where you're sitting and what you've lived. Drop your location in the comments. I want to know who's out there listening and seeing themselves in this. After that conversation, Lila tried calling again, multiple times. I didn't answer. Not because I was afraid of what she'd say, but because I finally understood the game. She wanted to control the narrative, to be the one who revealed the secret, who detonated the truth on her own terms, and I wasn't going to give her that stage. Nana, however, did answer when Lila showed up at her door 2 days later, unannounced, crying, angry, demanding explanations and loyalty. Nana told me later that Lila accused her of loving me more, of choosing me, of taking my side, and Nana responded with a sentence I wish every family had engraved on their walls. I'm not taking sides, I'm choosing integrity. Lila screamed that Nana was destroying the family, that I was manipulating everyone, that the secret was supposed to stay buried, and Nana replied calmly, secrets rot families from the inside. Truth gives them a chance to heal, even if it hurts. Lila left furious, slamming the door, and that was the last time Nana heard from her directly. The fallout was immediate and messy. Extended relatives started whispering. Some had known, some suspected, some were shocked, and suddenly I was no longer just the difficult daughter or the sensitive one. I was the keeper of a truth that made people deeply uncomfortable. Some relatives reached out with apologies, others with excuses, and a few with accusations that I was airing dirty laundry. And that phrase, dirty laundry, made me laugh for the first time in weeks because laundry only gets dirty when you refuse to wash it. My relationship with my parents shifted again, not healed, not broken, just redefined. My father started individual therapy, my mother oscillated between guilt and defensiveness, and I set firm boundaries around what conversations I was willing to have. No rewriting history, no blaming Nana, no asking me to fix Lila, and they agreed, awkwardly, imperfectly, but they agreed, and Lila, without the family scaffolding she'd relied on, spiraled. Publicly, social media rants, vague accusations, dramatic quotes about betrayal and being misunderstood, and I watched from a distance, not with satisfaction, but with a strange sense of finality, because she was finally visible for who she was without my silence propping her up. One evening, Nana and I sat in her living room, tea cooling on the table, and she said, "You know, the hardest part about telling the truth is accepting that some people will never forgive you for it." And I nodded, because I was living that reality in real time. She told me she didn't regret keeping the secret as long as she had, not because it was right, but because she'd been afraid of what it would do to us. And then she added, "But I regret not stopping the harm sooner." And that distinction mattered, because it separated intention from impact, something my parents were still learning to do. As the weeks passed, I felt something solidifying inside me. Not bitterness, not triumph, but a kind of grounded self-trust, the knowledge that I could survive uncomfortable truths, that I could set boundaries without collapsing, that I could love people without sacrificing myself. And just when it felt like the storm had finally passed, Nana called me one afternoon with a tone I recognized immediately, the tone she used when she was about to change everything again. She said, "I need you to come over. There's something we need to put in writing." And I knew, without her saying it, that the next step wasn't about inheritance or punishment. It was about closure, legal, emotional, and permanent, because the truth doesn't just demand to be spoken, it demands to be acknowledged in ways people can't walk back from. And as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door, I realized the reckoning wasn't over yet. It was just moving into its final, irreversible phase. One that would force everyone involved to live with the choices they'd made, and the ones they'd avoided, for good. When Nana said we needed to put things in writing, I knew she wasn't talking about a polite memo or some symbolic gesture meant to soothe feelings. She meant documents, signatures, permanence, the kind of steps people take when they finally accept that pretending is more dangerous than fallout. And as I drove across town, my mind kept looping through every possible angle of what this could mean. Because families like mine don't make decisions cleanly. They circle them, delay them, dilute them, until nothing meaningful changes. But Nana wasn't like that. She'd lived too long and seen too much to keep bargaining with reality. When I arrived, she already had papers spread out across the dining table. Her reading glasses perched on her nose, a legal pad filled with notes in her neat, slanted handwriting, and the first thing she said wasn't dramatic at all. It was practical. "Sit down, sweetheart. I want you to understand everything before anyone else gets involved." And that sentence alone told me she was choosing transparency in a way my parents never had. She explained that after the party she'd requested a full accounting of her finances, not because she suspected theft beyond what we already knew, but because she wanted clarity, clean lines, no more assumptions, and what she found disturbed her more than she'd expected. There were withdrawals she hadn't authorized, small ones at first, then larger, all routed through accounts she'd once trusted implicitly. My stomach clenched as she spoke, because I could already guess where this was headed. Nana confirmed it calmly, methodically. Lila had accessed funds through a power of attorney my parents had helped her set up years earlier for emergencies that somehow always aligned with Lila's crises, never with Nana's needs. And as Nana walked me through the timeline, the pattern was unmistakable. Manipulation layered on top of enabling, layered on top of silence. I asked her how much, expecting a number that would make me angry, but the actual figure made me feel hollow instead, because it wasn't just money, it was time, trust, and deliberate deceit. Nana wasn't angry when she said it. She was resolved. And that scared me more than rage ever could. She told me she'd already revoked the power of attorney, frozen certain accounts, and instructed her lawyer to prepare documents that would legally limit who could act on her behalf going forward. And then she looked at me and said, "I want you involved, not because I want to burden you, but because I want at least one person in this family to know the full truth." And I felt the weight of that responsibility settle into my chest, heavy but steady, like a stone you build around instead of trying to carry forever. Later that afternoon, my parents arrived, separately, which was already a sign that things were fracturing behind the scenes. My mother walked in first, eyes darting to the papers on the table, immediately defensive, while my father followed more slowly, shoulders slumped, as if he already sensed the outcome. Nana didn't waste time. She laid out what she'd discovered, calmly, factually, without accusation, and watched their faces change as the implications landed. My mother tried to explain, then justify, then redirect, saying things like, "We thought it was temporary," and "Lila promised she'd fix it." Phrases that sounded painfully familiar. My father said very little, but when he did speak, his voice was quiet and raw. "I didn't stop it," he admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my place." And Nana responded with a line that cut through the room like glass. "When you see harm and choose comfort, you've chosen a side." My mother cried then, real tears this time, not rehearsed, not performative, but still tangled in self-preservation. She kept asking what Nana planned to do, as if the decision itself was an attack, and Nana answered simply, "I'm protecting myself," which felt like a radical act in a family that had always framed protection as selfishness. I sat there listening, noticing how different this felt from every other confrontation we'd ever had. No shouting, no triangulation, no demand that I smooth things over, just consequences unfolding in real time. After a long silence, Nana said she intended to restructure her estate in a way that reflected behavior, not titles, and my mother immediately bristled, asking if that meant Lila was being cut off. Nana corrected her gently but firmly. "It means I'm no longer rewarding harm." And that distinction mattered, because it wasn't punishment. It was accountability. My father nodded slowly, as if something inside him was finally aligning with reality, and then Nana asked me if I had anything to add. The room went still, all eyes on me, and for a moment I considered staying silent, letting the process unfold without my input. But then I remembered every time my silence had been used as permission, and I spoke. I said I wasn't interested in revenge or redistribution. I wanted boundaries, transparency, and acknowledgement that what had happened wasn't a misunderstanding but a pattern, and I watched my parents absorb that, not defensively this time, but with a tired recognition of people who could no longer deny it. After they left, Nana and I sat together in the quiet house, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor, and she asked me how I felt, and I surprised myself by laughing softly, not because anything was funny, but because for the first time I didn't feel crazy. I felt grounded, validated, and oddly calm. Nana smiled at that, saying, "That's what truth does when you stop fighting it." As the days passed, the ripple effects spread outward. Legal notices were sent, accounts audited, responsibilities reassigned, and with every step Lila's anger escalated. My phone filled with messages from unknown numbers, accusations, threats, pleas, sometimes all in the same text. She accused me of poisoning Nana, of manipulating documents, of stealing what was rightfully hers. And then in the next breath begged me to talk to Nana for her, to soften her stance, to fix it, and that whiplash told me everything I needed to know. She didn't want reconciliation. She wanted control restored. One evening she showed up at my apartment unannounced, pounding on the door, shouting my name, and for a moment my old instincts kicked in, the urge to open it, to explain, to soothe, but I didn't. I watched through the peephole as she paced, cried, cursed, then finally left, and instead of guilt, I felt relief. Because for the first time, I was choosing safety over familiarity, about halfway through all this. I want to pause and ask you something. Where are you watching from right now? What city, what country, what kind of family dynamic shaped you? Drop in the comments, because stories like this don't exist in isolation. They echo across living rooms and childhoods everywhere. Not long after that, Nana called me again, her voice steady, telling me she'd finalized the new arrangements, not giving details, just assurance that things were settled. And then she added, almost as an aside, "Lila's coming by tomorrow." My heart skipped. Not from fear, but anticipation, because I sensed this was the confrontation she'd been avoiding and the one Nana had been preparing for. The next day, I came over early, not to mediate, but to witness, to be present without interfering. Lila arrived tense, eyes red, jaw tight, and the moment she stepped inside, she launched into her narrative: betrayal, abandonment, unfairness. How everyone was against her. Nana let her speak without interruption, which unsettled Lila more than any argument would have, and when she finally ran out of steam, Nana responded quietly, "I love you, but I don't trust you, and until those two things align, this is how it has to be." Lila exploded then, screaming that Nana was choosing me, that she'd always chosen me, that I was the favorite now, and Nana shook her head, saying, "This was never about favorites, it was about integrity." Lila turned to me, eyes wild, demanding I say something, anything, to take responsibility, and I told her the truth, that I wasn't her enemy, but I wasn't her shield anymore either, that she needed help beyond what family could provide, and that no amount of blame would change the facts. She left in tears, slamming the door, and the house felt strangely peaceful afterward, not because the pain was gone, but because the chaos had finally exited the room. Later, Nana admitted that conversation had been one of the hardest things she'd ever done, but also one of the most necessary. She said something that stayed with me. If love doesn't include limits, it turns into permission for harm. Weeks passed, and slowly, the volume of the conflict diminished. Lila entered a program, not out of enlightenment but necessity. My parents began attending counseling together, confronting dynamics they'd spent decades avoiding, and I found myself in a new role. Not caretaker, not scapegoat, but observer, participant by choice rather than obligation. One night I sat alone on my balcony, city lights flickering below, thinking about how strange it was that everything had changed, and yet I felt more myself than ever. And just when it seemed like the worst was behind us, Nana told me there was one final matter to address, something she delayed because she wanted to be sure. She said, "There's a conversation we haven't had yet about what happens when I'm gone." And I knew then that the next phase wouldn't be about conflict, but legacy, about what stories survive and which ones finally get laid to rest. And as I closed my eyes that night, I realized the reckoning wasn't finished. It was evolving, and the choices made next would shape not just how this family ended, but how it might begin again, in a form none of us could yet predict. By the time Nana said she wanted to talk about what happens after she's gone, I realized the story was no longer about exposure or confrontation. It was about legacy and who gets written into the future versus who keeps living off borrowed narratives. Because inheritance isn't just money or property. It's permission, it's validation, it's the final statement of who mattered and why. And families like ours treat it like a crown passed to whoever screams the loudest or performs the best. Nana refused that game entirely. She didn't summon everyone at once. She moved with intention. First my parents, then me, then eventually Lila, but never together, never giving anyone the chance to hijack the conversation. When she spoke to me, she was direct. She said she wanted her story documented clearly so no one could rewrite it later. She wanted letters written, not dramatic speeches. Letters that explained her decisions in her own words, not as punishment but as truth. And she asked me if I'd be willing to help her organize them, not to influence content, but to make sure nothing was lost or misinterpreted, which in our family had always been code for manipulated. I agreed, knowing exactly why she asked me and exactly how that would be perceived later. But for once I didn't shrink from that inevitability. Over the next few weeks we spent afternoons together, tea cooling on the table, sunlight shifting across the room, Nana dictating memories, moments, observations she'd carried quietly for decades. She talked about watching my parents choose ease over fairness, about seeing Lila learn early that charm could override accountability, about seeing me learn the opposite lesson, that silence was safer than protest. She admitted she'd failed us both in different ways, and that owning that failure was part of what she needed to do now. These weren't sentimental sessions. They were surgical, precise, and strangely relieving, like lancing an old wound so it could finally drain. At one point she paused and asked if I ever resented her for not stepping in sooner. The question caught me off guard because I had quietly, subconsciously, but saying it out loud felt dangerous. I chose honesty anyway. I told her yes, sometimes, but that I also understood how power works in families, how elders convince themselves they're preserving peace when they're really preserving patterns. She nodded, accepting that without defense, saying, "Understanding doesn't erase impact, but it does. Let us choose differently next time." Meanwhile, my parents were unraveling in their own way. My mother oscillated between remorse and resentment, some days sending messages filled with apologies, other days forwarding articles about forgiveness and family unity like passive-aggressive homework assignments. My father grew quieter but steadier. He started asking questions instead of issuing statements, small things like, "What do you need from me right now?" which felt monumental coming from him. Lila, on the other hand, spiraled. Her program attendance was inconsistent. Her messages alternated between self-pity and rage, and she became obsessed with what Nana was planning. Convinced that something catastrophic was being orchestrated against her, she called extended relatives, tried to rally sympathy, painted herself as the victim of a calculated coup. And for a while it worked with people who preferred simple villains to complex truths. Then Nana mailed the letters, not all at once, not publicly, individually, sealed envelopes addressed to those involved, explaining her decisions, her boundaries, her reasoning, and crucially, her love. She didn't accuse, she contextualized. She didn't shame, she clarified, and the effect was immediate and irreversible. People couldn't argue with her tone, couldn't dismiss her as manipulated or confused. It was her voice on the page, steady and unmistakable. When my parents received theirs, they came to my apartment together for the first time in years, sat on my couch like guests instead of authorities. My mother cried quietly, my father stared at the floor, and neither of them blamed me, not once. They talked about how exposed they felt, how they'd convinced themselves that keeping Lila afloat was the same as protecting her, how they'd used my stability as a crutch to avoid making harder choices. My mother admitted something that stuck with me. She said, "I think I was afraid that if Lila failed, it would mean I failed. And I couldn't survive that." That admission didn't fix anything, but it explained a lot. And explanation without excuse is a rare thing. About halfway through all this, I want to pause and ask you directly, where are you watching from right now? What part of the world are you in? And more importantly, are you the one in your family who keeps things running quietly while everyone else takes credit or collapses? Tell me in the comments, because stories like this aren't isolated incidents. They're patterns repeated across cultures and kitchens and childhoods. The day Lila received her letter, she showed up at Nana's house unannounced again. But this time Nana didn't open the door immediately. She waited, not to punish, but to let the moment land. When she did open it, Lila was shaking, letter crumpled in her fist, accusing Nana of betrayal, of rewriting history, of choosing me. And Nana listened, then said something that ended the argument before it could escalate. "I'm not choosing between you and your sister. I'm choosing myself." Lila didn't know how to respond to that, because self-choice wasn't part of the script she'd learned. She left in silence, not dramatic, just empty, and that silence followed her. People stopped engaging with the chaos, stopped feeding the fire. Consequences began doing the work arguments never could. Weeks later, Nana told me she'd finalized everything, not just legally, but emotionally. She felt lighter, more herself. And then she dropped a sentence that shifted the ground under me. She said she wanted me to be the executor, not because she trusted me more, but because she trusted me differently, because I'd shown I could hold truth without weaponizing it, and that terrified me. Not because I didn't want the responsibility, but because I knew what it would symbolize, the final confirmation that the family narrative had changed permanently. I asked her if she was sure. She smiled and said, "If I weren't, I wouldn't ask." As time passed, the intensity cooled into something quieter but deeper. My relationship with my parents stabilized into something tentative but real. Boundaries clearly marked, conversations slower, more deliberate. My mother stopped trying to smooth everything over. My father started calling just to check in, not to ask for anything, and Lila became a ghost on the periphery, occasionally resurfacing with updates about therapy or work or vague attempts at reconciliation that never quite landed. I didn't chase them. I didn't shut them down either. I stayed neutral, grounded, present but not available for old roles. One evening, Nana and I sat watching the sunset, and she said something that reframed everything for me. She said, "Families don't break when someone tells the truth. They break when the truth is no longer allowed." And I realized then that the reckoning wasn't about exposing lies. It was about reclaiming permission to exist honestly. But just when it felt like the arc was bending toward resolution, Nana told me there was one final conversation she needed to have, not with me, not with my parents, but with Lila alone, and she wanted me to know it was happening, not to attend, not to intervene, just to be aware. She said, "This one will hurt, but it has to be done." And as I drove home that night, I understood that the hardest part of this story wasn't over yet, because closure doesn't come from justice alone, it comes from acceptance. And acceptance is where people finally decide whether they will change or calcify. And I didn't know which way Lila would go, but I knew whatever happened next would define the rest of our lives in ways none of us could undo, and that realization stayed with me, heavy and unresolved, pulling the story forward into a final chapter that refused to be neat or predictable. The last conversation Nana had with Lila didn't explode the way everyone expected, and that was the most unsettling part of it, because silence can be more violent than screaming when it finally lands. Nana told me about it days later, while we sat at her kitchen table in the late afternoon light, her hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She said Lila arrived already armored with explanations. Apologies stacked like flashcards, stories rehearsed the way she'd always rehearsed emotions. But Nana didn't interrupt. She didn't correct her. She didn't even ask questions. She let Lila talk until the words ran out, and there was nothing left but breath and blinking, and the sudden realization that no one was coming to rescue her from the truth she'd just spoken out loud. And then Nana said one sentence that changed the temperature of the room completely. She said, "I believe you're sorry for how this turned out, but I don't believe you're sorry for what you did." And Lila collapsed into tears that weren't performative or strategic. They were hollow and raw and terrified. The kind of crying that happens when the story you've been telling yourself stops working all at once. Nana didn't hug her. She didn't push her away either. She just stayed present, grounded, unmovable, and told her something that no one had ever told her before, which was that love without accountability isn't love. It's indulgence. And indulgence rots people from the inside out. Nana said she loved her and always would, but that she would no longer protect her from consequences or from herself. She said if Lila wanted to be part of the family moving forward, it would require rebuilding trust slowly and honestly, with no shortcuts, no triangulation, no manipulation, no entitlement. And Lila listened in a way she'd never listened before, not because she suddenly understood everything, but because there was finally nothing left to argue against. Nana told me Lila didn't apologize again. She just nodded, wiped her face, and left quietly. No drama, no accusations, no slammed doors, and Nana said that scared her more than any outburst ever had, because real reckoning doesn't announce itself. It settles in and waits. After that day, things shifted subtly but permanently. My parents stopped trying to force reconciliation timelines and started asking what repair would actually look like, which was a first. My mother began therapy on her own instead of sending inspirational quotes to the family group chat. My father started visiting Nana without an agenda, just sitting with her, listening, learning how to exist without managing optics, and Lila disappeared for a while, not in a performative way, just offline, unreachable, focused inward for once whether she wanted to be or not. And I stayed where I'd been learning to stay, present but not entangled, available but not absorbent, no longer volunteering to carry what wasn't mine. At the midpoint of all this, I want to ask you something directly. Where are you watching from right now? What city or country? And more importantly, are you the one in your family who finally stopped playing your assigned role and felt the ground shake when you did? Because stories like this ripple far beyond one house or one bloodline. They live in millions of quiet realizations happening behind screens just like this one. The weeks after that final conversation weren't dramatic, but they were heavy, like the air after a storm when everything smells different and you're not sure what survived. Nana's health declined gently but steadily, not in a tragic way, just in the way time does when it's done pretending. We spent long afternoons together talking about ordinary things, memories from her childhood, mistakes she wished she'd corrected sooner, moments she was proud of. She told me she didn't regret how things ended, because endings aren't something you control, only how honestly you show up before them, she said, watching Me choose myself without cruelty gave her peace she didn't know she needed, and I told her watching her finally choose herself gave me permission I didn't realize I'd been waiting for. One evening as the light faded, she asked me if I was afraid of being alone now that I'd stepped out of the family pattern, and I answered honestly. I said sometimes, but not as afraid as I was of disappearing inside it. She smiled at that, a small tired smile, and said that was how she knew I'd be okay. Nana. Passed quietly a few weeks later, no chaos, no unresolved drama, just a stillness that felt earned. The aftermath was exactly what you'd expect, and nothing like it at the same time. Some relatives resurfaced with opinions and interpretations. Some stayed away entirely. My parents grieved in different ways, my mother cycling through guilt and sorrow and reflection, my father quieter but more present than he'd ever been, and Lila, when she came to the service, didn't sit in the front or command attention. She stayed toward the back, eyes down, hands folded, no performance left to offer. The will was handled cleanly, transparently, exactly as Nana intended, and while the specifics mattered less than people expected, the symbolism mattered more than anyone admitted. Nana had rewritten the family hierarchy not through punishment, but through clarity. Those who showed up honestly were included. Those who relied on illusion lost their leverage, and that shift couldn't be undone. After everything was settled, life didn't magically become simple, but it became mine. My parents and I began the slow process of building something new. Not what we'd lost, not what we pretended to have, but something smaller and more real, with boundaries named out loud and expectations spoken instead of assumed. Lila reached out months later, not with apologies or accusations, just a message that said I'm in treatment, and I'm learning how much I don't know about myself. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted you to know. I read it several times before responding, and when I did I kept it simple. I said I'm glad you're getting help and I hope you keep going, and that was it. No reconciliation arc, no cinematic closure, just a line drawn where there used to be chaos. And that was enough, because the truth most people don't want to hear is that healing doesn't end with everyone holding hands. Sometimes it ends with everyone standing where they actually belong, separate but honest. Months later, as I sit here telling you this, I'm aware that some people will call this revenge. Others will call it betrayal. Others will say family should always come first no matter what. But here's what I've learned the hard way. Family loyalty that requires self-erasure isn't loyalty, it's compliance. And compliance is how harm hides in plain sight. The moment you stop participating in that is the moment the system exposes itself. Not because you attacked it, but because it can't survive without your silence. If you're watching this and recognizing yourself in any part of it, the quiet one, the reliable one, the one who keeps the peace by swallowing the truth, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not dramatic, you're not selfish, you're not cruel for wanting fairness. You're responding to imbalance the way healthy people eventually do, by stepping out of it. And that choice will always upset the people who benefited from you staying small, but it will save the person you were becoming invisible to, which is you. This story doesn't end neatly because real life rarely does. It continues, unfolding in quieter, braver ways. And if you want to understand what happens next, how identities rebuild after family systems crack, how power shifts when truth replaces performance, and why the hardest part often comes after the confrontation, when the dust finally settles, then you'll want to watch the next story, because this wasn't just about what my family did. It was about what happens when someone finally refuses to carry what was never theirs, and that ripple goes much further than one porch, one letter, or one inheritance. It reaches into the lives of anyone who's ever wondered what would happen if they stopped playing the role that was hurting them, and that question, once asked honestly, never really lets you go.